Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Talking Transformers. My name is David, and on this particular episode, we're going to be joined by the one and only Mr. James Robert. But before we get on with that, first of all, I do need to make a very brief apology, especially to our Patreons. I wasn't able to get the last episode's video up in time. There was a few shenanigans going on and real-world tech issues that were preventing us from getting to that. So I do apologize about the late upload. Everything is up there now, and we'll have more content coming in the future. Just remember that, again, if you ever want to watch the full video podcast, you can do so exclusively on our Patreon. It goes up at exactly the same time as the audio one, so nobody has an advantage. But if you do want to see James's swanky setup, then I would highly recommend heading over to our Patreon, where for as little as £1 a month you can check out the full video podcast. This particular episode we're going to be talking about James's new book, which is just announced earlier on this week, Chaos Theory. So if you want to know more about that, then listen ahead in just a couple of minutes. We really do start the conversation out by talking about it, but also just be aware that if you want to get your hands on a copy of the book, you will be able to do so for the very first time at Minicon in Manchester at the end of this month. So if you want to know more about that and you want to get tickets for the Manchester Minicon, you can do that by going to tfnation.com. Anyway, that's enough from me. All I need to do now is thank all of our Patreons who are at the Voyager class level. So that's Adam White, Andy Hudson, Bill Ledson, Chibu, Chris Ford, Gareth Pollock, Gordon Packer, Hertzbolter, Lee Trailer, Lola, Nick Snowden, Nikki, Owen Williams, Pete Willis, Richard Fieldhouse, Sam Silvermoon, Starsaber Fan 38, and Stuart Cook. Thank you all again for your continued support, and on with the show. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Talking Transformers, the show where I, David, talk to somebody about Transformers who likes Transformers. And on this episode, I am pleased to announce I have got the one and only Mr. James Roberts. James, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here with you. That sounded sarcastic. No, I am.
You did, yes. Yeah, I must admit. Yeah.
That's my default setting. No, it is lovely to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
And can I just say that I am, for the benefit of those who are seeing this on our Patreon, I am loving the setup. It is perfect for the kind of conversation that I want to have with you today, because I've had the fortune of chatting with you about Transformers, and specifically your work on Transformers, over the course of
15 years now?
I was going to say it's been over a decade now, hasn't it?
Yeah.
In a terrifying way. But I thought, given the fact that I've got you for about 45 minutes today, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more broadly about storytelling, about your love of stories, and really sort of the genesis of you becoming a writer. But before we get into that, I would be remiss if I didn't start talking about the fact that you've just announced a new book, which is going to be going on sale at the Manchester Minicon. So why don't we get that out the way first? Because I'm very excited about this. Chaos Theory, Tell us about it.
So, Chaos Theory, the story, was my first solo Transformers story. So last Under the Records, Nick and I had done, and then that was in 2010. And then in 2011, Chaos Theory came out, and it was it wasn't kind of scheduled to happen. It was a case of me badgering IDW to let me tell this story about Megatron becoming captured, and him and Optimus having like a two-header basically. But comics are all very tightly. The production schedule is very locked down. And then at the same time, if this isn't a paradox, things change a lot as well. So I was trying to find a way in. Anyway, so it was going to be a one-off, and then it became a two-part story, and then it got folded into Mike Costa's ongoing. And it's 15 years since I pitched it, 14 years since it came out. There's kind of shades of TF1, so it felt like an appropriate story to revisit in kind of book form. So I've done the 6 More Than Meets the Eye notebooks to date, and I've done 2 script books, which is More Than Meets the Eye scripts. Funnily enough, the very first script I tried to sell, I sold at conventions, was Chaos Theory about 14 years ago, in a very kind of cottage industry, kitchen table, homemade photocopy type of way. This is all bells and whistles, very, beautifully designed by Bunker Creative. It's got a kind of 60s Pelicans books vibe, and it contains obviously the two scripts, but they are very voluminous. There's lots of words, they're long and detailed, because it's my script, and also because it's a very dialogue heavy, or certainly part one is. They're all newly annotated, so you've got all these extras, director's kind of commentary, if you like. And then a third of the book, it's a big book, 140 pages, a third of the book is taken up with the story of how how Chaos Theory came to be. And I've even reproduced some of the emails between myself and IDW, well, kind of my half of them anyway, to give people an insight into the winding road that it took to get this off the ground. So yes, launched exclusive launch at TFN Minicon.
Thinking back on it now, almost a decade and a half later, what's your opinion on Chaos Theory now?
Well, funnily enough, I've written an introduction to the book, and in it I kind of say that it might be, for some people it is the best thing I've done. Sometimes I think it's the best thing I've done, and the reason there's a kind of bittersweetness to that is that was my first solo story. So has there been a sort of decline since then? Did I peak very early? And I think, well, sometimes, again, as I say in the book, it was very arrogant of me, or ambitious of me, to say to IDW, given my inexperience, to say to them, you don't know much about me yet, but I reckon you should entrust me with telling the story of how Optimus Prime and Megatron met and how that meeting informed their respective ideologies, bearing in mind, David, that this hadn't been explored in IDW yet. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do it, because, we were 6 years into the new continuity, and surprisingly, it hadn't actually been established what Megatron or the Decepticons' long-term goals were. What did victory look like? So all this kind of lovely unplowed fields. And so I think sometimes I think it's the stuff I'm most proud of, the story I'm most proud of, it's in part because, you get one chance if you're lucky to kind of to tell that type of story. And for me, it just happened to be very early on.
You mentioned there that Chaos Theory was your first published work, professional published work.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And, Mike Costa's series, divisive, some might say. And along came Chaos Theory off the back of Last Stand of the Wreckers. And I think if you weren't there at the time, you really don't understand just how much of a lightning moment Chaos Theory really was. In hindsight, 15 years later, what's your memory of that?
I mean, I think any creator, particularly any creator, when they're starting out, and I think anyone will say to you that yes, actually, they do want to know what people think of your stuff, because until that point, it's just your own opinion and your editors, really. So you do want to see what the fandom made of it, and I was conscious that, Wreckers began as a Nick project. I mean, the story's been very well told. It began as a Nick project. I was brought on after the process had begun. And Nick, and this is critical, Nick had 2 stories already published. He'd done the Cup Spotlight, which was amazing, and everyone loved it, and rightly so. And then he did the kind of sequel of sorts, Everything in Its Right Place, which was an 11-pager in one of the All Hail Megatron Coda issues, right? So his stories were, I think, universally loved, and he was, again, quite rightly lauded as hot new talent, writing talent. And then when Wreckers came along, the fans would be forgiven for thinking, okay, well, we know Nick's great and Wreckers is great, and so probably most of that is down to Nick. We know nothing about Roberts. So when it came to Chaos Theory, when the solicits came out and people saw my name attached, okay, there was some, I'm sure, some kind of residual Wreckers goodwill, because I was, attached to Wreckers. But like I say, the fact that people didn't know the extent of my contribution to Wreckers meant that I was still really an unknown quantity. So I felt I had a lot to prove to readers. And so seeing Chaos Theory be embraced was a relief and a kind of validation as well. So, yeah, I remember it.
So let's park Transformers for a minute. I'm sure they will come up again.
Mm-hmm.
But what I want to do is spend a little bit of time talking to you about storytelling in general and your love of stories and things like that. So let's go all the way back. Do you remember what the first book was that you ever read?
That I read myself or had read to me.
Well, that's a very good question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So go on then. I'm assuming read to you.
Yeah, so I remember like really young, Mr. Men were my favorite, and then going up very quite the Bear books, these hardback books that
Hmm.
were kind of half comic, half text. Half a page was the illustration, and there was usually some rhyming text, and so used to have them read to me as well. Rupert and Bill Keep Shop was my favorite of that one, of that series, and then still in the reading to you phase. The Enid Blyton books, the Island of Adventure, the Of Adventure series, 8 books, and then the lesser known but arguably better Rubber Dog Mystery, and there's a kind of, Enid Blyton I think wrote 800 books in her lifetime, and they are very formulaic, but
Not a famous Five fan. Was
oh
that
yeah,
in the
Famous Five as well, yeah, and
Yeah.
not Secret Seven fan. I don't think too many people. But yeah, I remember really loving those stories, and my dad in particular would read me those. And one chapter was the default. If it was if I'd been good or there was something special, then 2 chapters. Once in a blue moon, I might get 3 chapters in a single sitting. That was pretty special. So that was kind of, I suppose, in a way, all of them were quite old fashioned. Mr. Men were the most contemporary. um, and then when I came to read my own stuff, well, or read for myself, I wasn't much of a reader as a kid until I got into comics, actually. So the early storytelling that I really fell for was comics based.
So before you started reading comics, but was there some kind of storytelling that you immediately found yourself gravitating towards?
I remember being really into the multi-part imported animations like Ulysses 31 and Cities of Gold. Dogtanian, and to an extent those which would be about 26 parts. And I think I like the fact that, in contrast to the other imported cartoons that we would get, you'd either get the imported cartoons from America, where it was all kind of by design, status quo reestablishes itself every episode, back to square one, or you had the UK, the British programs, which there's usually about 6 to 12 episodes, and they were fantastic. But they were very self-contained. And then these ones, like Ulysses in particular, like a serialized multi-part story with a proper beginning, middle, and end. The fact that it was an adaptation principally of the Odyssey, and then with elements of the Iliad, didn't recognize that age 9, but I liked that the story went on week to week to week, and it was therefore epic. And then the satisfaction, which I don't think I'd had as a cartoon fan at that age, of watching the last episode and think, oh, okay, yeah, that's it then. It's finished and it's satisfying, and there isn't anything else. There's no other story to tell here. So I think those were quite formative.
And the only problem was back in the day, it was trying to make sure that you did get to watch every single episode.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, it reminded me of that era of kind of running home after school to watch stuff like that. And then Grange Hill was the other one. So I don't know what your international reach is, David, but for your non-UK fans, that was a quite groundbreaking children's TV show about set in a comprehensive school. So kind of like a bit of a rough working class school. Absolutely terrifying when you're at primary school, and this is your one conception of what secondary school is going to be like, but very compelling nonetheless. And that told some pretty gritty stories as well, particularly when you're under 10.
Would you say that you were more of a Grange Hill guy than a Biker Grove guy?
By the time Biker Grove, my brothers, so I've got 2 younger brothers, and they were more into Biker Grove. I think by the time Biker Grove appeared, I was probably in my mid-teens, so I was
You'd
probably a little
aged
old.
out.
Oh, yeah, I was a little old for Biker Grove, but
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So that was my kind of, I suppose, in both cases, yeah, serialized storytelling rather than the more episode, the self-contained stuff.
And it's interesting that you mentioned there that you gravitated to multi-part stories because ultimately, what is more multi-part than a comic book?
Yes, exactly, and we're not talking Transformers necessarily, but yeah, comic books as well can ape the conventions of a TV show as well. Particularly, I say these days, it's been a while now with the new model of television, prestige TV and kind of adjacent TV formats. They do tend to shy away from the more kind of network TV style, done in one episodes, where things are more or less reset, and the pendulum's completely swung the other way, where you have a more decompressed, connected, long form storytelling, which is not always the right thing, actually. We may have gone too far the other way now, but yeah, comics and TV shows, lots of parallels. TV comics and sitcoms also lots of parallels.
Yeah. And so what sort of comics were you reading at the beginning then?
So people are going to hear this and think that I was just like I've sat alongside other people of my age into Transformers and other kind of, and I say this with love, geek pursuits. And they always seem to be into all this really cool stuff really early. And I think back to my happy childhood, and it seems relatively barren in terms of media consumption or even toy consumption. Like, apart from collecting Lego and before that Matchbox cars, like I really wasn't. It wasn't until Transformers came along, and I was by then, I missed the boat. I was 10. This was 1986 when I got into Transformers. There wasn't really much else I was into. So comics wise, it was like the funny books. It was Whizzer and Chips and Buster and Beano, comics which are, wonderful examples of their craft, but they're not really held up for their well, it's not the type of storytelling you and I are going to talk about tonight. It's more, it's economical, it's clever, it's hyper condensed, but it's not. You don't you rarely do you think, oh, I can't wait to see how this is going to unfold for Dennis the Menace next week. Because by design, comfortingly, it's back to square one next week. So I was into the kind of Fleetway and DC Thompson things, and then I really think it was actually only when TFUK, when I got into that I discovered the joys of what was then, relative to me, grown up comic storytelling.
But what did you notice about Simon Furman's Transformers comics that made you a fan?
Yeah, no, that's a fair question. So 113 was the first one I went and got, myself, that I owned. But my first one I remember reading was my brother's friend's copy of Prey Part 1, issue 96, which again was a good kind of did whet the appetite. Has that famous ending where it appears that Prime is dismembered and torn to shreds, and that was so. Even that, it sounds odd, and it's only now in the context of these questions I'm really kind of formulating it in this way. But yeah, cliffhangers were new to me. Comic cliffhangers didn't really happen, and particularly when you're not getting that comic. So it was months before I worked out what had happened to Prime. So that maybe on some level that cliffhanger kind of stayed with me unresolved for another couple of months, 3 months, until 113 came out. So the thing about the Simon storytelling, and again, you've got to juxtapose it with what I was familiar with. I didn't feel, it's going to sound like all this is implicitly criticizing the Beano. I'm not doing that, but the Beano caters for particular tastes and a particular audience, and it's like a funny comic, right? By contrast, Transformers seemed very serious. It was very serious-minded. Furman used language which was new to me, and I'm not just talking about Furmanisms, but there would be coup de grace, or I can't think of any other examples now. But there was quite sophisticated language for a children's comic, so that was intriguing. And I just liked how the story was. I probably couldn't even articulate it at the time what I liked about it, but it was very well constructed. He worked very well within the 11-page confines. It felt compressed, but not too compressed. It foregrounded the characters really well, and it just felt thrilling. It felt like, even to someone coming into this quite new, I could feel the stakes were there. It felt it felt impactful. I suppose that's the best word. It felt impactful, and I wanted to go back and find more. And it's a bit like your first love, I think. Everything does feel dialed up to 11. So I remember that first flush of just really being into it, and I was always into it. But I remember how I know I was particularly enamored from 113 onwards is that for the first couple of months, 2-3 months, I can remember vividly where I was for each issue, where I read it. So yeah, it left a huge impression on me.
Isn't it somewhat ironic that the memory that a lot of us, whether you were a fan of the cartoon or whether you're a fan of the comic book, the memory that sticks with us the most is Optimus Prime dying in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, true, true. And that's going to do it to you, isn't it? It's going to
It
just yeah.
really is, because specifically for me, I remember seeing Transformers the movie. I
Mm.
remember where I was. I remember buying the VHS, taking it home, and then watching it. And when Victor Caroli famously says at the end of the movie, and Optimus Prime will return, I remember telling my parents, we cannot turn the video off until he comes back.
Oh wow! Oh my yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah.
So, yeah, something about Optimus Prime dying is the thing that makes a lifelong Transformers fan.
I think maybe that's the common thread. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Um, Once I got into TFUK, and
Mm,
this is kind of again with hindsight, I guess it's kind of symptomatic of how I am really. If I discover something that I like a lot, then I need to dig deep and I need to see what else is out there. And
mm.
so, in very quick succession, being a kind of late developer with comics, very quickly I just I started looking at 2000 AD. I started looking at I'd get Eagle occasionally, um, and and then the other kind of Marvel UK stablemate titles, and I was really interested to see what was out there. So it's funny because issue 113 came out in May '87, and then fast forward a year, which when you're young feels like 10 years, but in the space of 12 months, it was Dragon's Claws was coming out, and Death's was coming out, and the Sleaze Brothers were coming out. Like I said, 2000 AD monthly, I was getting trying to get all the back issues that way. And yeah, suddenly my appreciation of this art form exploded, and I was just reading and hoarding comics voraciously.
And did you ever find yourself drifting towards sort of just more prose storytelling as opposed to comics? Or was it just comics that you loved?
A little bit. I'd occasionally, pick up from the library or the school library. Science fiction was my prose thing. So and science fiction short stories, and my grandparents would get me kind of the classics, sort of Asimov and so on, which at that age I found quite hard to get into. Um, and I remember actually it was because I was from '88 onwards, since we're still in that era. I was a very big Red Dwarf fan, as people know, from the beginning, which was '88. And then after the first three series came out, so we're talking late '89, they brought out the novelization of, the book version of Red Dwarf. So it tells a similar story, but slightly different, called Infinity Welcomes Careful Drivers. And now that I remember like devouring, read that in about three sittings, reread it, because it spoke to something that I already loved, and then I found the thrill of something which was which was entirely a TV medium in book form. All the extra detail, the extra world building. You can see where I'm going with this. The scope to flesh out the characters, and the first section of the book, it isn't even on Red Dwarf. It's when Rimmer and Lister meet on one of the on a moon, and I was like, yeah, that's great. That's really expanding the parameters of what I'm used to. So that was really exciting. And so from issue 1113, mid '87 to the end of the '80s, 2.5 years. In that time, I kind of did a comic speed run, and to an extent a storytelling speed run, and just started. By 1989, I was subscribing to Speakeasy fanzine, which was I just needed to get under the bonnet of UK comics and see, who are these creators and what other stories are out there.
And if anybody's sort of listening internationally, especially if you're in America, I think it's important to point out that our comic book revolution of the 1980s was very different to the comic book revelation of the 80s in the US markets, where you would see books like The Dark Knight, for example, coming out, which was sort of redefining Batman for a new generation. Whereas here, I suppose the parallel would perhaps be, and it's perhaps a bit of an awkward one right now, given what's happened, but Sandman, for example, or Swamp Thing, these sort of more off the wall kooky stories were more prevalent here in the UK than what you would necessarily find in the US. Because, as you say, something like 2000 AD, not exactly tights and flights.
There's lots of ammunition, lots of material here for a long chat, actually, because it's really interesting. The two things you've described accurately. What's interesting is that they are, they're connected, aren't they? Because the year that punk broke in the UK, 76. Not long after that, we had the launch of Action comic, infamous and controversial because it was like properly violent. And I know people tend to big up these things. People of a certain age, if they're talking about something which pertains to their generation, that there's this kind of bias towards extraordinary, to make everything kind of particularly extraordinary. But Action was surprisingly violent for what it was. And then very soon after that, the same person was involved, Pat Mills, launch of 2000 AD. Action was cancelled or suspended and then came back in a much more sanitized form. 2000 AD was good from the outset, but it took a few years to heat up. A few stories aside, and by the early 80s, you had Judge Dredd was well established. You had Halo Jones, which was Alan Moore. You had Slane, or Slane, I think is the nerdy pronunciation of that, and so on and so forth. You had Nemesis, the Warlock, and things. And the people that worked on 2000 AD, like Pat Mills, and like Alan Moore, and like Alan Grant, etc., and Grant Morrison, a lot of these creators were poached by DC in particular in the mid 80s, and they were enticed across the Atlantic, not least because they get paid better for their work, and in some instances, they'd get creator-owned rights and so on. And that's when you had, Frank Miller is an exception; he's American, but you had Sandman. Neil Gaiman worked on 2000 AD a little bit. Grant Morrison was doing his Animal Man stuff. The DC Vertigo stuff was really principally driven by that wave of UK fostered creativity, which, as you said, was very rarely sort of capes stuff, cape shit, as people say. And even the one exception in 2000 AD was Zenith, was kind of parodying that and being typically meta about the whole thing. So yeah, so the US benefited from kind of the UK explosion. The other interesting thing is that in lieu of things like Swamp Thing Swamp Thing wasn't big in the UK. It was imported and it was popular, but it wasn't like a UK newsstand thing at all. In that vacuum over here, while 2000 AD was still doing really well, it was actually Transformers UK and the birth of the licensed comic, for better or worse, that filled that gap. And so the mid to late 80s really was Marvel UK's story, thanks mainly to Transformers UK, and then the real Ghostbusters, and then a different company, but the Turtles came in at the tail end of the 80s as well, sold hundreds of thousands a week, and that was what the UK market was like. There was a parallel market in the UK, which was the more adults only stuff. It was post Dark Knight Returns. It was all about sequential art. Couldn't just call it comics anymore. It was a graphic novel, which the name itself tells you about its insecurities. And Dark Knight Returns did do well. Killing Joke did well. Arkham Asylum with Dave McKean and Grant Morrison. That was UK creators. So we had a popular and thriving, albeit niche, older reader market in the late 80s. We had Crisis and we had Revolver and stuff like that, and Strip from Marvel UK. And then by 92, if that, 91, 92, the bottom had fallen out of that and it all fell away really. So that was a very compressed history of the comic buying experience of a Brit, Brit adjacent, in the 80s.
What is it you think that made the UK such a fertile ground for creators, especially within the comic book market at that time?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think if you look at, given the size of the UK population, and let's include Ireland as well. So you look at UK and Ireland. It's not they're not big places geographically. They're not that populous. We're talking, I don't know, combined 60 million at the time maybe, and yet they punch above their weight creatively, and a lot of the of Britain's kind of soft power, as they call it, sort of cultural heft, cultural influence, comes from a time in the 20th century when we were a fading imperial power, but an imperial power nonetheless. And I'm not saying that in a celebratory way at all, because not to get too dark, but we subjugated millions of people, killed lots of people, but we had reach, we had global reach, we were an imperial power, and then so that gave us a certain we could tap into certain reserves there, creative reserves. What was also interesting was, we had a powerful working class, and there was far more opportunities for working class kids and working class young people to express themselves creatively, to break into industries like music and comics and books. Um, and it was all very fertile for that. And I suppose, and I think, I can't psychoanalyze the British psyche, but going back to what you said about 2000 AD, it was violent, but it was irreverent, and that was the key word. It just kind of gave the finger to authority. It was anarchic, and I didn't see that so much in America or other places. It's something peculiarly British at the time, and it takes us back to what we were saying about punk and that kind of that two fingers up on authority, um, in a healthy way, no respect for anyone or anything, that kind of pitch towards ultra violence. Although, and I don't know, just to kind of ironically, given that the Brits are often thought of as being very, well, we are very class conscious, and some of us can be very deferent, but it was kind of the opposite of all that. It was saying, no, we're not going to, tug our forelock. This was the comics creators, 2000 AD in particular. We're going to take the piss out of that. We're going to satirize that, and we're not going to resort, if that's the right phrase, we're not going to resort to telling superhero stories to do that. We can do that in other ways. So yeah, I think there's a much bigger conversation to be had around why that's changed. But that's my best guess at why the 70s and 80s were particularly fertile, like I say, for that type of talent.
Yeah. When do you start thinking to yourself, I can write, I'm a writer?
Yeah, so I, despite not reading a huge amount of prose stuff, by the time I was in the last year of primary school, so this would have been 1987 into 88, and I'd have been 10/11, and I was already just filling up jotters, notebooks with my stories, and they were almost always science fiction stuff. I guess I just found it a comfort zone thing. So I was already doing lots of creative. We had creative writing class. That was by far my favourite, and I had good feedback from the teacher by and large. There's a different story about this one teacher that, in fact, yeah, the first long form fanfic I wrote was kind of, they had a quote from this guy at the beginning who was being very disdainful of what I was trying to do. Anyway, generally teachers were really supportive, and I felt, okay, well, maybe I've got a knack for this. Family was supportive too, but they always say nice things, don't they? So I was already doing non-Transformers creative writing and getting good feedback and enjoying it critically. And then when I got into Transformers with a vengeance from kind of, November 86 onwards, and then got into TFUK with all of the kind of unbridled passion that characterizes stuff that I get into, it was obvious that I was going to start writing Transformers stories. I didn't know, fanfic wasn't a term I was familiar with at the time. I was just telling stories about, the thing that I enjoyed. And when the UK comic finished in the early 90s, as you were saying, 91, 92, the Transformers, well, Transmasters, an unofficial fan club, kind of sprang up to take over the reins creatively, to keep the story going. And, that's not to retell a story that's been told a lot, but that's when I really leaned into it and started, taking my creative writing seriously, because I had an audience for the first time. Now, it may only have been 5 people or 10 people or whatever, but I was writing for people. I knew that my stuff would be read, and it would be read by people that knew the characters I was writing about. So yeah, that really was kind of like a turbocharge for me.
That would ultimately lead to Eugenesis in, what was that, 2000, 2001?
Yeah,
Which, to my mind, is the first Transformers novel that perhaps anybody actually wrote. I mean, how many pages was that? It was
I
three.
well, I'll get my copy actually.
Oh,
Um, so
yeah.
here it is.
Look at the size of that thing.
Yeah, so it is 560 pages. Yeah. Um,
Just punctuated with the sound of a book slapping on a
But,
desk.
Eugenesis was the kind of apotheosis, the zenith, the end point of all the fanfic Transformer stuff I've been doing in the 90s. So I started, contributing to newsletters and other people's fanzines. Then I did my own prose-based Transformers fanzine called Transtext, and I always did lots of stories for that, of course, as the editor. I was the main contributor, and that lasted 7 issues. And in the pages of Transtext was a story called Invasion, which was essentially an early version of Eugenesis. And when Transtext finished, it finished in like '93, and I felt I didn't do as much. I wasn't as active in the club in the mid '90s. Came back and did some scripts for the club comic, and then at the same time started doing prose stuff again. Now, in that time, so probably '93, '94, I went through a similar experience as I'd had when I really got into comics. So suddenly, I really got in belatedly. I really got into fiction, prose fiction, and so I just read what I was really into at the time. And I know this is very white and it's very Western, so forgive me, but it was John Updike and Graham Greene and Martin Amis, Nabokov. So okay, not all Western, but anyway, I read hundreds of books, and I like to think that I started to finally get it in terms of what makes a good story and what makes a good prose story. So when I came back, post Transtext and started writing, not many fanfics for the club again, but I did one called Telefunken, and then I started working on Eugenesis, and I thought, okay, well, this is kind of going to be my final word on this for me. This will be my kind of grand gesture. I knew it was going to be book length. I didn't know it was going to be quite as weighty, and it took about 3 or 4 years to do. Self-published, as you say, 2001, only 150 copies. Took 2 very heavy suitcases to my first ever Transformers convention, actually, Transforce in 2001. Met Nick Roach for the first time, met Jack Lawrence for the first time, and lots of other people that I'd known through pen pal stuff. Sold out in 10 minutes. I've only got 2 copies left, actually, so kind of one for each of my children. And then I think I did one more Transformers fanfic after Eugenesis in 2006, actually. So it wasn't long before I started pitching to IDW, and it was just kind of it was to tie in with Target 2006, and that was kind of the end of my. I haven't done any fanfic since.
Well, no, and nor should you either. To quote a famous philosopher, if you're good at something, make sure you get paid. So,
Yeah.
what would you say lends itself to a good story?
Okay, that's a big question.
It is.
I remember. Okay, so 2-part answer. Part one. At the time, I remember, and this is either a superficial relationship or a very deep one, depending on where you stand. But I remember it was the quality of the prose, that was really arresting. So this was, there's a quote that I can't remember, but it's about, the difference between poetry and prose and words. The poetry is the best words in the best order, and prose is kind of one down from that. But I just remember thinking, okay, these are so evocative, the way things are being described and the connection I'm feeling with the characters, and that's through the most beautiful language. So I fell in love with the language being used, and that encouraged me to expand my vocabulary. In terms of story structure, there wasn't too much that I felt I could carry over into comics when the time came, because a book is a prose book is a different proposition. It was when I got people are going to think we planned this out, because the segues that you and I are doing are quite elegant, I have to say, David. But it was when in the late 90s, no, actually that's wrong. No, it was mid early 90s, 93, 94 when I got into X-Files and other TV shows, and sitcoms in particular. That actually was I learned more lessons from that way of telling stories that were relevant to comic storytelling, because that was about um, economies of language, using, particularly with sitcoms, being able to get the measure of a character in only a few brushstrokes. And sometimes it tips too far and you get caricatures, but you could, yeah, the way you could um, convey to readers the measure of a person, of a character, um, in only a few lines or a few scenes, or how they reacted to certain situations. So that was what I took away from TV. Um, and in terms of broadening it out then to kind of storytelling generally, I what to say? I think I'll start with a negative. What I find very difficult in telling stories now is, like, and I know I need to break away from this, but I often I'll kill a story idea really early because I think, yeah, but it's kind of been done. It's kind of been done. So it's invalid in my mind, which, as I say, is the wrong approach. I'm like, okay, well, it's either hackneyed, or it's tropey, or it's cliched. There's nothing new in it. And the trouble is, and I know this instinctively, pretty much every story has been told. And if you want to get kind of deconstructive about the whole thing, there's academic studies which will say, really, there's, depending on who you read, there's only 5 different plots, or only 12. I think 12 is the highest I've seen. And every story you read or watch in whatever medium is a riff on one of those 5, 7, 12 plots. So I should really internalize that, because of course what's different is, if you're lucky, and I'm not saying I have, David, but if you're lucky enough as a storyteller to have a kind of unique voice, or have something about you which makes you a bit different, then it's applying that voice to a story which may have been told before in a different way. That's what keeps things interesting. So anyway, all that said, I'm not good at that, so I tend to walk away from things early on, because I think, okay, that's been done, it's boring, or it won't. People will read that and think, oh, but I've seen a version of this before, I'm not interested. So that's the first thing. Second thing would be that you can. I'm not speaking from a position of kind of academic rigor here. So I'm not saying, as professor of stories, here's my breakdown. But my observation as a consumer of stories and as a teller of stories, pretentious, is that you can have stories which feel very constructed and feel very plotty, and one thing happens after another, and the sequence of events that happen are driven by the need for them to happen, if that makes sense. So it's easier if I tell you the opposite approach, which is that events in a story happen because of decisions taken by the characters within the story. So I think a bad story is one which would have played out in roughly or entirely the same way if there were different characters at the heart of it, So in most of the stories I've written, I've tried to root events in individuals and have, a critical decision being made, a critical choice being made. And yeah, that's the thing, that the character can go one way or the other. And if you've created a good character, then you won't be surprised by the decisions they make. That their own personality lends themselves towards that particular decision, and then consequently other things will happen. So it's because they themselves said, okay, we're going to do X or we're going to do Y, that then the subsequent plotty stuff happened, and not just because there was a feeling that, okay, I need to get from A to Z as an author, and almost kind of irrespective of what the characters think or feel or do, we're going to get to Z. Does that make sense?
It does. There might only be 5, there might only be 12 stories that you can possibly tell. But it
Yeah.
is all about taking those particular blocks and putting them in a different order that's sort of
Yeah.
unique for it. Do you think then that Transformers is quite fertile? Because really, given the inception of the brand, it has very much just been a very basic good guys versus bad guys. Whereas the story that you told was, what if good guys stuck on spaceship flying through space together?
Yeah, I think. Well, so yeah, I think there's me kind of railing against tropes, but obviously, More Than Meets the Eye is extremely tropey. I like to think it's birthed some as well, but I mean, just the sense of it's a found family. It's a quest. Well, first of all, it's a bloody quest, isn't it? Okay, so that's the mother of all story. You know, if we go back to the oral tradition of storytelling and the aforementioned Odyssey, for example, you know, you've got okay, plot number one, quest, hero's journey, right? So you've got that. You've got there's a word for it, but kind of it's a confined space. You know, you're forced to be with people that if you had the choice you wouldn't be. You know, so you've got this kind of forced family set up. And all, so yeah, I mean, the ingredients of More Than Meets the Eye are each of them individually are not really new at all. But as you said earlier, the combination hopefully is what gives rise to interesting things. So yeah, we we by which I mean the people that have been lucky enough to be involved in producing Transformers stories, we have all been very lucky and very unlucky to different extents at different times. Um, I'm thinking of Bob Budiansky in particular. You know, so what sets modern era Transformers apart? And by modern era, I'd probably go back to the early 21st century. So we're talking nearly a quarter of a century. But first time round, as we all know, the main impetus was to promote the toys, right? And that's why poor old Bob, who was writing the main book or the book when Transformers peaked, and for a while afterwards, was tasked with incorporating literally dozens of characters. There's another book I'm working on now about the rise and fall of Transformers in the 80s and 90s. It's a non-fiction book, of course. And I think I'd tally, there's 140, at one point there was 160, 148 characters that he had to juggle with, and issue after issue, here's 5, 10, 12 more characters. So there was no way anybody could make that work. And it's a miracle that he did as well as he did and managed to tell some very enduring stories within those constraints. So he had that to deal with. Furman did to an extent as well. And then with, when G1 first ended and we came back in comics with Dreamwave, now there was some, it's all commercial, but when I say sort of commercial imperatives, I mean there was some need to incorporate some characters, that some Dreamwave stuff. And I think, Dave, you know Dreamwave very well. There was the Armada, there was the Minicon type era, wasn't there? So there was stuff,
Yes.
bring them in. But that was really the final flush of there are toys coming out. We have to include them. There was a couple of instances in the IDW era, me and John, where Combiner Wars and things. We were told to feature X, Y, Z, but it was by no means to the same extent as Bob. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, as the Transformers universe has grown, it has expanded outwards in every medium, and it's proven itself to be able to support incrementally, exponentially. It can support all sorts of different stories, and that gives the next generation of creators and the one after that more confidence to be experimental, to push things out a little bit. So we're getting a wider variety of stories as well these days. The final thing is, and this is where people can be lucky, and where I was lucky, you get to do a new thing once, right? And with More Than Meets the Eye, and I remember it really clearly when I was pitching it, and I wanted the Justice League International cover. And I remember thinking, and this was 2010 when I was putting it together. So that's 15 years ago, and there was 26 years of Transformers at that point. So not a bit, a lot, but not like we're not talking a lifetime. So 26 years in, and as far as I recalled at the time, there had never been a Transformers team book, right? Like a superhero team that hadn't been done, and neither had there really been like a light-hearted Transformers book. Now, More Than Meets the Eye was light-hearted sometimes. It was incredibly the opposite sometimes as well.
Issue 6.
Yeah, this is it, right. But then, so I guess where I was lucky is I at that point, 26 years in, no one had done it before really, and so I was able to say, okay, this is going to be new for people. They might like it, they might not, but it's a new. So you're taking a pre-existing, well-established kind of trope, which is, again, found family, a team book. If you want to talk in the vernacular of comics, it's a team book. It's like X-Men. Let's do X-Men, but for Transformers. Well, let's do Fantastic Four, but for Transformers, or Justice League. So that was the thing, and it gets harder to do those new combinations of things as the brand grows, as the brand goes forward, and as it goes outwards in terms of the sheer quantity of content produced. It gets harder for successive generations of creators, if you like, to find the hitherto non-combined ingredients that, for example, I was able to find.
I think that is a wonderful place to wrap this particular podcast up, because I have a feeling that there needs to be a part 2 to this at some point, because I feel like we're just cracking the surface of reinventing Transformers and bringing Transformers back into the conversation. But I'm very conscious of the time for both yourself and I. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a pin in this, and I'm going to say, James, thank you so much for joining me on this particular episode. And we will be back, I will say, not too far off in the distant future, after the release of Chaos Theory, because I really want to dive into that book. And I think it might be a good idea using this as sort of a launch pad for us to just dissect a little bit about the storytelling tropes and the callbacks and all of the inspiration that went into the early books that you put out with IDW, because I think it would be rather fascinating. It certainly will be for me, and I'm sure the listeners will enjoy it as well. But
no, I could hear myself getting enthusiastic earlier, so that was a novelty. But that sounds good. And also, I'd love to talk to you about the next big project, which is a history of Transformers fan culture in the 90s. And we can link it to storytelling, because there was a healthy fanfic community from the mid 80s. But the type of stories that community were telling were very characteristic of that era of fans generally. So all of fandom as a kind of modern concept. The earliest Transformers fans were telling very unique stories. So I'd love to talk to you about that.
Fantastic. I can't wait. So, James, thank you so much for joining us. We will catch you very, very shortly. And if you haven't got your tickets already, just remember that James will be at Minicon in Manchester in, March. It is March, the end of this month, in just a couple of weeks' time. So I will see you there, and we will probably touch a little bit more on this conversation then. So, as I say to everybody, say goodbye, James.
Goodbye.
Bye, all.